Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to Ellensburg, Washington, USA. The local time is 5:47 p.m. here in Pacific Time Zone, Western North America. And our program on Israel Russell will begin at 6 p.m. local time. Thank you for joining us. 12 minutes from now. How are we all doing tonight? Spokane, Mojave, California. Perfect picture, Star Climber. Thank you. Yeah, we always, hey Neil, we always want to make sure we're doing okay. We're barely using the chalkboard tonight, so don't be bothered that you can't see the whole chalkboard, please. The Dalles, Rainy, 5x5, wonderful. Hello, Eric from Virginia. I'm a few minutes early. I got a bunch of thank yous here. Hello, Jeff from Vindman's Bakery. Speaking of that, so Jeff was just here 5 minutes ago. The owner of Vindman's Bakery, downtown Ellensburg. You gotta love it. And Jeff brought over another present. He said he got a call from Gene in Puyallup. And Gene said, hey, would you send over a baker's half dozen of lemon currant scones to Nick, please? So Gene, thank you. You read my mind. You know, I'm a cheapskate. I was about to head down at 5 o'clock and get the half price day-old Danishes, but I don't have to do that now because of Gene's generosity. Liz already grabbed one. She just got back from a long run. So lemon currant scones. Vindman's Bakery. You gotta love it. Thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Gene. Yeah, I don't know what happened today, but the mail just wouldn't quit. So, very kind of you. I'm always embarrassed, you know that, but I'm also very grateful for the acts of love and generosity. So before we do a few thank yous here, let's get the schedule out. So Tuesday night we were talking about Spokane geology, and last night we were down at Ginkgo Petrified Forest State Park with Kevin, the ranger, for a few minutes, and then we looked at the petrified wood down there. We talked about George Beck and his important work. We took a little drive. I won't hang the phone out the window anymore. That was I wasn't thinking about the wind noise. I wanted you to have a nice clear video picture, but I didn't think about the audio. So live and learn. Tonight we're talking about Israel Russell. Who? Exactly. We'll talk about him tonight. I've learned a lot today. And I won't see you tomorrow. I'll see you Saturday morning talking about Kittitas Valley. Now, of course, the forecast is now talking about 25-mile-an-hour winds, whereas last weekend when I set the schedule, it was calm. So understandable. Things can change weather-wise, but I really had a plan to go out and do a field excursion, but I just don't know if I can do it in that kind of wind. Because I won't have Boxy McBox with, or maybe I will. I'll think about it. And then Sunday morning, Paleomagnetism. Okay. So, rapid fire thank yous. Again, I don't expect any of this, but thank you for the kind gestures. Mr. C from Union Gap, south side of Yakima, about half an hour away from here, sent me a book, Weatherman's Guide to the Sun. Looks like some kind of treatment of dealing with solar flares and other things of that nature involving the sun. I will enjoy reading this. Thank you, Mr. C. D. Miller from Othello, Washington. He did ask me if I had a need for a bunch of loops, a bunch of hand lenses, as we call them in geology. Let me give my impression of a 19-year-old who's never used one of these before in our geology lab. I don't know what, I can't tell what it is. We'll hold it closer. I can't. No, you gotta do that. Well, I'm not gonna do that. Come on. Come on. Get down there. Oh. So D. Miller sent, I don't know, a dozen of these to be used at our school, I think. So thank you very much. I hope you just had these laying around, Mr. Miller. I hope you didn't buy these specifically for us, but we do have a need and we will put these to good use. Hopefully this fall when we're face to face with our students, who knows? James from across the border, British Columbia. James from Oliver, BC. Thank you for the book. I did not know about this book. Okanagan Geology South. Handsome cover. And just paging through it an hour ago, it looks like we've got a variety of text and some really nice maps. Looks like you're just kind of taking a drive from Osoyoos north on 97, I guess it is, heading up to Penticton. So I'm still hoping to do that this summer with Jerome, and I'll have a living road guide with me in the passenger seat, Jerome, but in addition to that, I'll have this, so thank you. But wait, there's more. Ron from Seaside, Oregon. This is his second gift. You might recall Ron. He makes bolo ties. Nature's Wonders. This episode of Nick from Home brought to you by Nature's Wonders. Handcrafted stone jewelry. And to work on a theme from last night, Ron sent a very nice note and said that he made a second bolo tie for me, this time out of petrified wood from a piece of petrified twig that was collected up on the Saddle Mountains that we could see from Ginkgo Park last night. So thank you, Ron. Very kind of you. And I've been wearing your other bolo tie around town. Of course, everybody has to comment on it. Sometimes positively, sometimes like, what's going on with you? Pandemic's really getting to you, huh? You're changing your look. It's like, I don't know, do I have a look? Oh yeah, you got a look. You got a look all right. I still got 5 minutes and I got one more present. It's a box from Spokane, Washington. And the note says, so Steve in Spokane, thank you for the basketball. Thank you, Steve, for the basketball. John Stockton. So according to the note, Steve got that autographed basketball at a charity auction in Spokane, and apparently John Stockton doesn't do that very often, but Steve bid on the ball. It's been sitting in his garage for a few years. He thought he'd send it my way, so thank you very much. Our oldest boy and his girlfriend are getting out of Beirut, Lebanon. There's some sort of, what's the term? Repatriation or flight or something like that. I don't know if the embassy's involved, I don't know what, but they have been able to get out of Lebanon. They've been both teaching at an international school there. They're flying into Seattle on Wednesday night, so after I'm done with you, I'm going to go to the airport and pick them up. And Max will be amazed with the John Stockton stuff. So I haven't told him about it yet. That's big news in our house. They know how much I'm into Muffler Boy. They know how much I'm into Muffler Boy. Anything else anybody wants to say? Western Australia, David, hello. Kathy. There's no flies here tonight. Yeah, that was that was something. Hello, Evelyn. It's always good to see you. I hope you come by again sometime, Evelyn. I'll keep my distance, but I haven't seen you in a while. Morgan from Eugene. Sid, Dick, Barbara, Blanche. John from the Okanagan, from Tenasket. Carson City, Nevada. Matt, hello. Boise. Looks like we're mostly Western North America folks. Hey, Jason. Still got one of those beers left, Jason. Thank you. Jason from last Thursday up on Saddle Rock. Anne Marie from New York City. Bruce from Texas. Moto Mining, West is best. Oh, Garrett from the Netherlands again. The Netherlands. Give me a big thumbs up and subscribe down below, and I'll see you at the next video. She's still cranking them out from the Netherlands. Oh, it's 6 o'clock. Okay, give me a second, would you please? And we will begin our program on Israel Russell. Well, a pleasant good evening to you all. Welcome to my backyard. My name is Nick Zentner. I teach geology at the college here in Ellensburg, Washington. We're back here in town. Last night we were 30 miles to the east over at Vantage, Washington, doing a little field excursion there. But we're back among the safe confines here this evening, and I'm hoping to introduce most of you, I assume I'm introducing most of you to this gentleman, Israel C. Russell. And you're like, boy, I haven't heard that name before. I thought I was into geology. Well, I was kind of in your club until 5 o'clock this morning. So Bijou the cat woke me up again, 5 in the morning, had his little breakfast, and so, okay, I guess I'm up for good. I can't get back to sleep. And the work began. And by work, I mean absolute supreme pleasure. It was a good day. I have no complaints. Most of these days are pretty good, but today was a especially satisfying day because Bob and Cleellum did me the great favor a few weeks ago of sending me some emails with amazing numbers of links. And all those links went to Israel's work. And over the years, I keep coming into that name, Israel C. Russell, especially if I'm looking at some older materials. And it's one of those, it's like, boy, I should really figure out what the backstory is on this guy and try to place him and why is he out here and what kind of work was he doing? How was he getting around? Did we catch him here in the Pacific Northwest doing geologic work fresh out of college, like George Otis Smith, who we talked about last week, or is this later in his career? So, I want to try to answer some of those questions for you. And yes, I've been thinking about this guy for 12 hours. That's pretty much it. But I like to be efficient, and I like to package things, and I like to deliver them as soon as possible. That's my version of feeling worthwhile, or like I'm doing something productive and helpful to all of us. And so we'll see if I can come through tonight. But there's some good stuff. I know these kinds of programs are not as popular as San Andreas Fault or Mount St. Helens 40 years ago. You know, you can just look at the view numbers and see these shows that just have an old guy's name on them are not going to bring in the huge crowds. But I think I might be able to make this work, not only by itself, but to make some connections with some things we've already been talking about. For instance, who did we talk about last night? George Beck. Here's George Beck's copy that was passed down to me of a work done, published in 1903. Lots of text. I showed you this last week because, was it 2 weeks ago? I can't remember. But the George Otis Smith show, I was excited to show you some of the maps and photos and other things from more than 100 years ago, and Bailey Willis, who I still don't know a lot about, but I know a little bit more of today. So this was one way to get me just kind of mildly interested in Russell, because George Otis Smith in particular, in this report, with all these beautiful old photographs from the first decade of the 20th century, and these beautiful old maps of the Chelan area, etc., Smith keeps talking about Professor Russell. Oh, Professor Russell said this in his report in 1893. I'm like, whoa, huh? Wait a minute. I thought Smith was the first guy, that the earliest report that I saw. I assumed George Otis Smith was starting from scratch. Not true. There were two significant geologic projects done here. Kittitas Valley, Liberty, down at Snipes Mountain, Grandpa Carl, Lake Chelan, Glacier Peak, Mount Stewart, back in the 1890s. By who? Russell. So I've got reports like this, not the originals this time. This is an original from 1903, courtesy of George Beck. But I pretty much wore out my printer up at school. I did all this research at home. About noon, I just pedaled my bike up to school, cranked out all these things that I want to share with you, came home, took a nap, and here we are. Here's one other way that we can use a past live stream and connect it and get us into Israel Russell. And this one's even more of a direct connection. I shared this with you long ago. It's a biography of J. Harlen Bretz that not only talks about the famous part of Bretz's story, which is being embarrassed at the big meeting of bigwigs from the USGS in 1927 in Washington, D.C., And one by one, those experts said that Bretz was full of malarkey, talking about a cataclysmic flood of water called the Spokane Flood in eastern Washington. Well, I thank John Sonicson, who lives in Spokane and loaned me a bunch of personal papers of Bretz, not personal papers, but unpublished memories of Bretz, which I need to get back to you, John, by the way. I promise. Once this is all done, I'll get that back in the mail to you. Hell, I might even drive over and visit you again. But there's one passage in this book, the biography of Bretz, one of the biographies of Bretz, and here we go. Bretz is teaching high school in Flint, Michigan. Do you remember this part of the story if you saw that show? So Bretz has just finished a college degree, Albion College. His first job in the real world is a high school science teacher at Flint, Michigan. And Bretz, in 1905, 1906, is pedaling his bicycle around central Michigan. And just for fun, apparently, during the summers, and maybe involving high school students, making a glacial geology map of central Michigan. And at the Michigan Academy of Science in Ann Arbor, Michigan, this is the last 3 days of March, 1906. Bretz goes to this meeting, listens to these reports by the professional geologists, but he has his little amateur, this is Bretz we're talking about, his little amateur hand-drawn glacial geology map that I guess during one of the breaks of the sessions, Bretz shows his little amateur geologic map to the experts. Here's a high school teacher saying, look what I did for my summer vacation. And I looked up 2 hours ago the program, late March 1906. So here are some of the talks that Bretz in the crowd as a high school teacher was listening to. He must have took a couple days off of school, or maybe he had spring break. Glacial Features Between Crystal Falls and Menominee by I.C. Russell, 15-minute program. That's work that Russell was doing up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Glacial Features of the Eastern part of the Northern Peninsula by Frank Leverett, Ann Arbor, Michigan, etc. So I.C. Russell was a professor at that time, 1906, University of Michigan. Now let's pause for just a second. What are we doing here? We're talking about this guy. We haven't even talked about him yet. And what are we doing in Michigan? Well, guess who was invited after that little show and tell back to I.C. Russell's house in Ann Arbor, Michigan, in the last 2 nights of March 1906, J. Harlen Bretz. And Bretz was in Russell's home, meeting him for the first time, and hearing stories from Russell about Washington. And Russell, in previous years, had done all this geologic work out here, and essentially was convincing Bretz he needed to get out to Washington if he was really serious about doing some of this Pleistocene geology. And in case you're still not interested in the topic tonight, that was the last 3 days of March 1906, and on May 1st of that year, I.C. Russell passes away at age 53. In the prime of his life, in the prime of his career, died of pneumonia. I don't know how long he was battling illnesses, but before we quit, I'm going to share some very heartfelt testimonies to the power of Russell, the expertise of Russell, but we have an intersection. The last 2 months of Russell's life, he meets a very young J. Harlen Bretz, and so there's an actual in-person connection between two of these very most prominent geologists of the late 1900s and late 1800s and early 1900s. Are you hooked now? That was my best attempt to hook you with my bolo tie and everything. Okay? Let's look at some whiteboards. Like you did with George Otis Smith, quiet. We'll look at a quick biographical sketch of the guy. Born in New York, got geology degrees at NYU, New York University, it wasn't called that at the time, got a bachelor's and a master's degree, got an assistant professor teaching job at Columbia, still in the New York City area, in the late 1870s. And then he stops teaching, Russell, we're talking about Russell now, the rest of tonight, and begins working for the United States Geological Survey. You heard of it? Right. Oh, but wait, this is the year that the USGS begins. So he's in on the ground floor. A brand new organization, and Russell is one of the superstars immediately, right out of college. And I'll share with you all his work that he did for the USGS starting in the late 1870s. There's a connection about a decade later with helping found the National Geographic Society, I.C. Russell. He hasn't been to Washington yet, by the way. For reasons unclear to me, Russell leaves the USGS officially as a full-time gig and becomes a professor at the University of Michigan starting in 1892 and keeping with that until his death, May 1st, 1906, a few weeks after he met Bretz at that meeting. Just to finish out the resume, he was the president of that. They had annual meetings, this Michigan Academy of Science, and that's one of those annual meetings in March that Bretz attended. And at the time of his death, he was the president of the Geological Society of America. And in those days, the GSA met in December of every year. And so Russell dies in May, but he had already written his presidential address, apparently. And so that presidential address was read in December of 1906 at the GSA meeting. And all that, you can find all that online. You can find, the internet is amazing, isn't it? Yeah, there's negative stuff too, but just to sit in my house in a 12-hour stretch and use the link sent to me by Bob, but then to do all sorts of other things and find all these original documents that were scanned, it's just amazing. It's a thrill. So I think we're still in the whiteboard session, and then I want to start digging in and showing you some examples of Russell's work. That's really, I think, why you're here. At least I think that you're here. So we just looked at that. Going double-fisted now. So what I'm choosing to do in blue here is, train boy, is to give you a general sense of the variety of this guy's career. And the first thing I want you to notice is that the work here in Central Washington, I'm not flipping you off, that we're going to sink our teeth into deeply because it's all these places here locally that we know and love, including photographs, including diagrams, including maps, and wonderful text. We're catching Russell late. He's not fresh out of college. He's fresh out of college. He's going to New Zealand doing some work. I don't have any detail. He's assisting. You remember those great surveys we were talking about a couple weeks ago? These great surveys that were basically doing first pass at trying to catalog and inventory and survey all the resources of the great American West beyond the 100th meridian. Favorite author, Wallace Stegner, shout out. So he was on the Wheeler Party, and they spent much of their time in 1878 in Colorado, New Mexico. So he's training with some of these hotshot federal scientists. And then 2 years later, I mean, if you're not a fan of geologists, I guess you don't know these names, but G.K. Gilbert is one of the biggest names in the history of geology here in North America. It's Russell out there assisting Gilbert. And they're going to the Great Salt Lake area, looking at Lake Bonneville. They're in Nevada, looking at Lake Lahontan. They're spending multiple field seasons. And have you spent any time out on a camping trip or something? You know how close you can get with people when you're in that kind of environment. But then if you're spending whole field seasons, like months together, 2 or 3 people, and you're working hard and you're stimulated by all these things that you're seeing and learning and drafting maps together, it's impossible to not have a really tight bond. And we learned that just from teaching our field courses. There's a whole different way of connecting with people in those kind of intimate field settings. By the early 80s, Russell's leading his party, and some of his best work apparently was done in the Mono Lake area. Do you know where that is? We're south of Reno. Today it's driving 395. You're on the east side of the Sierras, and there's Mono Lake, and there's Mono craters, and there's these incredible alpine glaciers that used to come down the east slopes of the Sierras and get down to the floor of Owens Valley, etc. So, I mean, this is the first time Russell's in charge, and he's cranking out some amazing stuff, apparently so amazing that I think at the time of his death, decades later, he was in the process of redoing it or something. I caught that somewhere today. Then suddenly he's, I don't know about suddenly, we've missed a few years here. I don't have every year covered. Another highlight was being up in Southeast Alaska, still working for the USGS, and harrowing accounts of trying to summit Mount St. Elias, and some deaths on his party as they're trying to land one of their boats at some icy harbor, I think it's called. Graphic stuff. You can just imagine the intensity of those experiences. And all of that is in the back pocket before we set foot in Washington. That's one of my biggest messages of tonight. So this guy's a seasoned pro. I don't know, can you do the math for me? He first comes to Washington in 1895. How old is he now? How old is he? He's in his 40s, right? So his reports that I'm going to share with you in black here, I'm not flipping you off, and his prose that I'm going to read to you in just a bit, going up Rainier on the north flank. It's from a 40-ish-year-old guy who has been trained by the best, and his standards are so high. And you'll notice that he's a professor by 1892, so he's coming out here in the summers, bringing grad students, just like Bretz did decades later. But the quality and the quantity I cannot overstate. Israel Russell, amazing work. Well, it's one thing for me just to say it's amazing. It's another to try to show it to you, read it to you, interact with you the best that I can. No Cozy 4 tonight. I can't show you any video. We can't listen to any radio interviews of Israel. I wish we could. I know of no biographies written of this guy, or movies or after-school specials. All we can do is go to the original reports, and that's what I've done. That's what I was printing out, and trying to just select certain things that attracted me and therefore might attract you and resonate with you. So, in order, I'm going to do these 3 Washington reports, okay? So we start with the field season of 1892. Now again, I used, up until these live streams, I would always talk about, Bretz is here in 1923. 1923, it's like, wow, dawn of time, Well then, that's modern compared to Smith, who's here in the field season of 1900. 1900. And now we got a guy here in the 1892. I mean, Washington just became a state. Ellensburg has got just a few, actually we had the big fire in 1889. Yeah, 3 years after the whole huge fires of, do you know Washington state history at all? There was a huge fire that wiped out downtown Ellensburg, huge fire that wiped out downtown Seattle, huge fire that wiped out downtown Spokane, all in the same summer, 1889. So here we are, field season of 1892, and by 1893, this is the published report. A geological reconnaissance of central Washington, Israel Cook Russell. Okay? So let me get my drink out of here. Do you need a photo? Here's about what Russell looked like when he met Bretz at his house. He's only late 40s here. This was taken in 1900. So I don't know if he looks particularly well. Not appropriate for me to say. But anyway, he was a kind of a frail looking guy, but just tough as they come out in the field. So this is maybe not the image we want for him when he's out here doing all this amazing work in his 20s and 30s and 40s. How about this? You want a photo? This is from 1890. Russell and his fellow geologists in Alaska. Love this photo. Now, these are some badasses here. Sorry, Patrick. I'm not flipping you off. I think that's Russell there. Still looks kind of sour. But I mean, these guys are doing everything. And they're not doing it in a suburb of Chicago. They're doing it in the wilderness. I'm not a huge macho guy, obviously, but I mean, what these guys are, the quality of what these guys are cranking out in those conditions, a little different than today when most people are sitting in their offices on Facebook all day. Sick burn. Okay, I might get carried away here, but I want to read passages here and there. So this is from the 1893 publication. Letter of transmittal from J.S. Diller, geologist in charge of Cascade Division. He's writing to the chief geologist of the USGS at the time, Mr. G.K. Gilbert. Sir, I have the honor to transmit herewith for publication as a bulletin of the Geological Survey a paper entitled A Geological Reconnaissance of Central Washington by Israel C. Russell. This work was initiated by your instructions on March 22nd of 1892 to investigate the vicinity of Yakima, Washington, with special reference to the artesian resources, water. Mr. Russell was detailed as my assistant in this work and remained in the field until June 30th. His studies were not limited to the Yakima Valley, but extended over a large portion of the country bordering upon the Great Bend of the Columbia, and have satisfactorily solved the artesian problems to which they were directed. While Mr. Russell was investigating artesian resources, the writer, before going south to continue fieldwork in Oregon and California, spent a few weeks in April and May making a preliminary examination of coal-bearing metalliferous and other formations of Washington. The mines at Wenatchee, Peshastin, Roslyn, Carbonado, Wilkinson, Newcastle, and Hamilton, and marine fossils were collected at Klamath Bay, Snohomish, and near the Duwamish to acquire the information necessary. On account of the important economic bearing of Mr. Russell's report, I respectfully urge its immediate publication. Very respectfully, your obedient servant, J.S. Diller. That's how they wrote all those things back then. Okay, here's Israel for the first time. You're going to hear his words now. This is a report of a geological reconnaissance in the central part of Washington undertaken for the purposes of ascertaining to what extent the conditions were there existing favor the project of obtaining artesian water for irrigation. The region traversed embraced about 10,000 square miles on foot and horseback, situated in the arid region east of the Cascade Mountains and draining to the Columbia River. He's describing the crystalline rocks. He's describing what he calls the Columbia lava. Patrick, that's the German chocolate cake. I'll read you some of that. Columbia lava. He's the first guy describing it now. The first white guy describing this in a scientific paper. The principal formation in central Washington is a great series of lava sheets which have been outpoured in successive eruptions in such quantities as to completely conceal the relief of the land which was inundated by the fiery flood. Talk about a gifted guy. He's here for a couple weeks and he can see that these are flood basalts and that there was a former topography underneath. Liz is going to the store. It extends, talking about the German chocolate cake, it extends south from Washington into Oregon and California and east into Idaho. The rock is principally, if not wholly, basalt, which came from the surface through fissures and was spread out in successive flows at intervals throughout a long period of time, as is shown by fossil forests enclosed between layers at a number of horizons. Who is this guy? He's supposed to be looking for water. And at a glance, he's completely correctly describing the Columbia basalt flows? Talking about petrified wood? George Beck isn't even born yet. Maybe. Oh, wait, hang on. Lake Lewis. Do you remember Ice Age, Lake Lewis? This is decades before Bretz now, come on. The glaciers from the north ended in a large lake, the northern shore of which crossed the central part of Douglas County and is now known as Lake Lewis. Icebergs floating on this lake carried their freight of boulders over the Great Plain of the Columbia and into many valleys opening from it. Okay, let's pause for a second. So there are narratives that get repeated over and over and over again. And I'm just as guilty as the next person to just, oh, what's that? Oh, what happened here? This person did what? And then you just repeat it like a frickin' parrot. But when you really start digging in and going to the original maps, the original reports, the narratives are often not totally on the mark. What's the narrative about J. Harlen Bretz? He's showing up, he's getting off the train, he's going out, doesn't know anything, starts finding all this crazy stuff in the desert and makes these maps. Now, I don't want to diminish Bretz, but we got a guy in the 1890s seeing Lake Lewis, talking about icebergs, talking about the flood basalts. All right, I'm a little snarky here tonight. Let's get back to a reverential tone. A little bit more, just kind of the introduction, then I'll show you a couple of the maps and the diagrams. We're still in the publication 1893, a geological reconnaissance of central Washington. This is still Russell now. During the reconnaissance, I was accompanied by Mr. Samuel Storrow, Storrow, a civil engineer residing in North Yakima, who is especially interested in the various problems connected with the irrigation of the adjacent region and has a personal knowledge of several of the deep wells already drilled. This is long before the Columbia Irrigation Project, right? Almost a century. More than a half century ahead of the irrigation project. I am indebted to Mr. Storrow of Yakima for much general assistance and especially for the topographic base of the map forming Plate 2, which was compiled and drawn after his connection with the Geological Survey had been discontinued. Ooh. Our work began on April 1st and ended on June 30th, 1892. So that's 3 months. And if you can, I'll put the link to this report in below this, in the show description, episode description. You'll be blown away at all the information from a 3-month reconnaissance. I'll stop talking like that, but it truly is impressive. The route traveled during this interval is shown on, okay, let's talk about where they were. Enough reading for a little while. So not only is Russell a trained geologist, he's also a gifted visual guy. He can sketch. He could take photographs. He's brought a camera with him. I don't know what kind of camera. So here's Samuel. Was it Samuel? I want to use his name. What did I say? Samuel. Samuel from Yakima. So all these sketches have a solitary Samuel. Here they are at the Simcoe landslide. Not sure exactly where that is. Down by Goldendale, I guess. Do you know where the Simcoe landslide is? Here's a photo. Photo from 1892. Samuel and the Simcoe landslide. I mean, I know there's photos and photographs in the 1890s, but to have them, here's Toppenish, Grandpa Carl, Toppenish landslide. They have literally a wagon train in the Grand Coulee. Photo by Russell. horses, McNeil Canyon, east of Chelan. The milk duds up there. Now, Russell's not talking about Ice Age floods. Let's not get carried away. I'm not saying that Bretz was an imposter. But Bretz had this work. Bretz had a lot of this work and read a lot of this work, maybe before he ever set foot out in eastern Washington. How about this? You recognize that, local guys and gals? Yakima River Canyon. There's Samuel. I think this is down by Burbank looking north, if I'm not mistaken. I didn't know there was some kind of dirt road in there. Did you? In 1892? Makes sense, but... Now, if you're very curious about where Israel and Samuel went on foot in that summer, I'll give you a few extra seconds to look at this. The red line shows the ground they covered on foot doing a recon in 1892. I'm going to come in here as close as I can, and I'll scan around a little bit. Is that in focus? The red lines are where these two guys went. Imagine walking around there, having training, and Russell's been to Mono, he's been up in Alaska, etc. So he's not a greenhorn, but still, your Grandpa Carl, they were right at Snipes Mountain for you. 1892. I had no idea. This predates my understanding of geology work in Washington by at least a decade. And if you knew all this already, good for you, but I certainly did not. Okay, I need to keep it moving. It's already 6:34. I got more to share with you, but that's a little sampler from the printer at school from 1892. Now, I promised samplers of the two other reports. And for reasons I don't totally understand yet, in 1896, field season of 1896, Bailey Willis, who I need to learn about, was the lead guy, and they're going to summit Rainier. And they're going to approach from the north. And Russell's along as an assistant. Remember now, he's a professor at Michigan. He's just coming out in the summers. And George Otis Smith is with them as well. And some other guys as well. So instead of showing you Willis's report, I want to read to you now. Because especially in these heartfelt testimonials to Russell after he died so suddenly in 1906, and these guys are just really kind of trying to be as, well, whatever. Very, very touching tributes to him. They kept talking about his prose, his ability to write, not only to photograph and to sketch and to scientifically report, but to write, to put the reader in that particular place. So you with me now? 1896, we got a party of Willis, Bailey Willis, George Otis Smith, Israel Russell, some assistants, three guys who are the camp hands. Okay, here's from the report written by Russell. They're going to start their journey from Carbonado. Do you know where that is? I think I had to look it up. Dinky little coal town north of Rainier, south of Tacoma. I'm sure you'll correct me if I'm wrong there. The tramp from Carbonado to the foot of the Carbon Glacier was full of interest, as it revealed the characteristics of a great region covered with a dense forest, which is part of the deeply dissected tertiary peneplain surrounding Mt Rainier. The rocks from Carbonado to Carbon River crossing are coal-bearing. Extensive mines are worked at Carbonado, and test shafts have been opened at a few localities near the trail which we followed. Near where Willis cut a trail back in 1881, we crossed the stream and the canyon broadens. It is deeply filled with boulders and is bordered by the forest-covered mountains, fully 3,000 feet in elevation above us. On account of the dense forests, the scenery throughout the region traversed is wild and picturesque. At a few localities, glimpses were obtained of the great snow-clad dome of Mt Rainier rising far over the intervening tree-covered foothills. Okay, so far, whatever, kind of general reading. Now it gets good, in my opinion. The forests of the Puget Sound region are the most magnificent on the continent. The moist atmosphere and genial climate have led to a wonderfully luxuriant growth, especially of evergreens. Huge fir trees and cedars stand in close-set ranks and shoot upward straight and massive to heights which frequently exceed 250 feet and sometimes are even in excess of 300 feet. The trees are frequently 10 to 12 feet or more in diameter at the height of one's head and rise in massive columns without a blemish to the first branches, which are in the many instances 150 feet from the ground. The soil beneath the mighty trees is deeply covered with mosses of many harmonious tints, decked with rank ferns, whose gracefully bending fronds attain a length of 6 to 8 feet. Lithe, slender maples, termed vine maples from their habitat of growth, are plentiful, especially along the small water courses. In many places, the broad leaves of the Devil's Club give an almost tropical luxuriance to the shadowy realm beneath the lofty canopies formed by the firs and the cedars. I got to keep going. In writing of life in this forest while prospecting for coal in 1881, Bailey Willis states that one of the fir trees, which was measured, rose like a huge obelisk to a height of 180 feet without a limb and tapered to a point 40 feet above. The more slender trees, curiously enough, are taller, straight, clear shafts that rise 100 to 150 feet, topped with foliage whose highest needles would look down on Trinity Spire. Cedars, hemlocks, spruce, and white firs mingle with these giants, and not competing with them in height, they fill the spaces in the vast colonnade. The silence of these forests is awesome. The solitude oppressive. The deer, the bear, the panther, all seldom meet. They see and hear first and silently slip away, leaving only their tracks to prove their numbers. There are very few birds. The wind plays in the treetops far overhead, but seldom stirs the branches of the smaller growth. The great tree trunks stand immovable. The more awful it is when a gale roars through the timber, when the huge columns sway in unison and groan with voices strangely human. I could go on, but I'm there with him. Aren't you? In 1896? In spite of the many attractions of the forest, it was with a sense of relief that we entered the canyon of Carbon River and had space to see about us. The river presents features of geographical interest, especially in the fact that it is filling in its valley. The load of stone contributed by the glaciers, from which the stream comes as a roaring turbid water, flood, is greater than it can sweep along, and much of its freight is dropped by the way, and on and on and on. They eventually get to the top of glacier of Mt Rainier, and it's no accident, I think, that Bretz is showing up to teach high school in Seattle. And what's the first thing he does with his hiking group? They're going to walk from Renton, and they're going to get on top of Rainier, and they get snowed out. But, I mean, I'm starting to realize this. You know how this works. You kind of, as you read and make connections, you realize there's kind of trend-setting people that maybe aren't super dynamic and boisterous, as you'll hear in a second, but they set the standard. and they set the way. And even the giants that many of us, bow down to often have even more impressive people that they're following. Okay, one more report that I want to sample for you. Then I'll share some of the heartfelt stuff after Russell's sudden death. And then we'll come to you, see what you want to ask about. 1900, sorry. Oh, wrong whiteboard. So the last one I want to share is from the two field seasons of 1897 and 1898. He's back out now here in central Washington. He's done screwing around with Rainier. That was a one summer only thing. And he's back to central Washington. He must have been impressed or felt like he wanted to come back and expand on his earlier work. And so he's covering a lot of the same ground, some new ground as well. He's making a glacial map for the first time, and he's making a more detailed geologic map. And he's also kind of in this time frame dealing with Smith and trying to get Smith started on making his Ellensburg folio and Mount Stewart folio. By the way, before I leave this for the last time, this is not the last field work. After this, and publishing this, Russell goes on to southern Idaho. He's on the Snake River Plain. He's down at Jordan Craters, which is in southwestern Idaho. He's over in the Owyhee. He's into Oregon. He was a workhorse and teaching the whole time during the school year in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Okay, so a little sampler from this last major report that I wanted to show you. And I think it's fun to not only give you a sample of it, but also see how the production values, quality of the photos, etc., has bumped up in just a few years between the 1893 publication and this. What I'm going to share with you is the publication date is 1900. And this is from the annual report of the USGS. So if you're familiar with these old documents, for a while there, they were publishing one big annual volume, very thick. You can find all these online, as I did. And so I'm just grabbing one of the chapters that has Smith's report. So, published in 1900, but summarizing the field seasons of, what did I say? 1897 and 98? Yes. Okay? Looks kind of similar to what we looked at before, but now he's talking specifically Cascades in quote-unquote northern Washington. But he's dealing with Stewart, he's dealing with Liberty, he's dealing with a lot of places that we've talked about a lot. Okay, I forgot I had a little bit of text here, but I think I want to read it to you. Okay, so he's back. The region referred to in the above title embraces a tract of country about 60 miles wide, extending from the Northern Pacific Railway, where it crosses the Cascade Mountains, northward up to the United States-Canada border, a distance of approximately 100 miles. A large portion of this area is included in what is now known as the Washington Forest Reserve, established in 1891. Only reconnaissance geological work had been done in this region, in other words, his work, and the present paper is intended as a preliminary report to be followed by more detailed studies. So he is kind of laying the groundwork for Smith's work a couple years later. Summer field seasons of 1897-98. The work done during those 2 summers was under the direction of Mr. Bailey Willis, assistant to the director, and to him I am indebted for every facility that could be afforded in aid of my work, and for the many suggestions based on his own observations in the same general field, more especially when he was connected with the Northern Transcontinental Survey. In 1897, my work began July 5th in Cle Elum, Washington, a station on the Northern Pacific Railway, and terminated at the same place September 22nd. God, when was school in, man? He's got these long summers. He must have had, maybe he didn't teach a lot in Michigan. During this interval, a preliminary geological examination was made of an area including about 750 square miles in what is known in the reports today of Mount Stewart Quadrangle, Detailed geologic work has since been done by Otis Smith. Okay. Early in July 1898, I resumed work at Cle Elum, Washington, reviewing. So I guess he must have lived in Cle Elum for a while. That's cool. In the company of Mr. Smith and Mr. G.C. Curtis, the conclusions previously reached in reference to the geology of Mount Stewart Quadrangle. And we started our recon through the Cascades to the north of Mount Stewart on July 22nd, 1898. And then we went all the way up to the Canadian border. This journey led me in a general way up the Wenatchee River to the head of Lake Wenatchee, thence westward, following the west fork of the White Creek to Indian Pass, down the Sauk River to its junction with the Skagit. Proceeding northward, I ascended the valley of the Skagit to the mouth of Ruby Creek, and then traveled eastward up the canyon of that stream to the main Cascade Divide. Crossing Crater Pass, I followed the Methow River in its junction with the Columbia, and then continued my exploration southward to Mission, a station on the Great Northern Railway in the Wenatchee Valley, where my party was disbanded on September 20th. Let's look at the routes. I gotta say one more thing. Concerning previously explorations in the region covered by this report, little needs to be said since, for the most part, it has received but slight attention from geologists. The eastern hold on. What? The eastern border of the area was visited by Professor George Gibbs during the surveys for the Pacific Railroad in 1853. And is briefly described in Volume 1 of what are commonly designated the Reports of the Pacific Railroad Survey. Gibbs also published a paper of the physical geography of the northwestern boundary of the U.S., in which attention was directed to the geography, climate, forests of the northern portion of the Pacific Mountains. Okay, I got to find that. All right, I promised a map of where those guys covered, including these nice maps, and then I'll show you some photos. Did you like those maps before with the little red lines showing them where they went? Where he and Sam went in 1892? Well, here's a slightly bigger party, I guess. 1898 field season. We'll start down here. Trying to get the focus good for you here. Pretty accurate glacial map, by the way. You know, he's not saying there's ice there now, right? He's reconstructing the last glacial maximum of those alpine glaciers. You know, in a few weeks. I got one more, I think. Hang on. Yeah. Wait. What? Did I leave it out? Oh, I think I did. All right, I'm sorry, I left out one of the geologic maps for some reason. It must be in the front porch. He's got sketches. Let me orient it to north. Here's north. So he's got the Methow coming into the Columbia. We're up by Pateros. These are Ice Age flood boulders, but he didn't know it at the time. 2 decades before Bretz. Gifted illustrator. This guy's sitting on a rock and he's pencil drawing. This is kind of typical of the Chelan area where of the Great Terrace. He's the first to really talk about the Great Terrace. And then these bedrock knobs sitting above it. Speaking of things I need to look into, I've always wanted to try to figure out which rail goes which place at which time. I mean, some people are hobbyists by the train stuff and they know Northern Pacific and Milwaukee Road. So I see maps like this. I love kind of elegant, simple maps like this. And all he's really showing are the rail lines. So one of these days, probably not for a live stream, but I really want to figure that out. the history of the rails here, which obviously predates the roads. God, I'm kicking myself I don't have that other quad, but here's a sample. Oh no, this is, well, it's a decent sample. So he's starting to, the wind's picking up here. He's starting to not only show his route now, but he's doing some bedrock mapping. This is, again, reconning for Smith, it turns out. I just made that connection right now. So Smith is not going blind. He's got Russell a few years ahead of him doing a first pass. Russell's at Liberty. He's talking to the miners. He's taking photos of some breccia that's got, you know, gold within it. Maybe blue agates. Say maybe blue agates, and then somebody said, "Is that an eagle?" So I said blue agles. How about this? He's in the Teanaway. He's taking a photograph of the Teanaway feeder dikes, part of the Liberty Gold story. I have no idea if you're into this, but I am. Pleistocene gravels, photograph, probably pretty close to Rob Reppin's mine. We had Rob in the backyard a while back. And I remember now what I wanted to do, just in case I felt like, again, when you're in a live room with people, you can sense the vibe of the room and you can tell if people are like, whatever. And then you kind of switch it up on the fly just to make some energy in the room. You say something stupid or you do something on purpose to just kind of change the energy. I can't really do that here. I can't tell. But I had a plan in case I felt just internally like things were dragging. So I found this attached to an email from Tom Foster. I had no idea he took this. This is Mount Stewart. Beautiful photo. And I'm including it here because Russell was dealing with Mount Stewart. You want proof? So here's a family photo a couple of years ago. Max, the guy coming home from Lebanon, is a big climber, and so he took his parents to the top of Stewart. You go down off the Longs Pass, you camp at the bottom, and then it takes you a full day to get up through the couloir, and then you get up on top and you get back. I only made it to here. But my wife is a specimen, so she was up there. But I show you this, which is a classic shot of the south face of Mount Stewart, because guess who took the same photo essentially in 1897? Israel Russell. And a few years earlier in our family's history, we had three very moody teenagers who were mean to each other, mean to their parents, mean to everybody. We've all experiencing that. So here they are in full sulk, totally unpleasant to be with. Had to bribe them to even go on the damn trip. I think we're like freshmen in high school, 7th grade, 5th grade, and Liz. And we're hiking to Ingalls Lake, first time they'd been up there. And it was my birthday, remember, July 20th. So there's still ice on Ingalls Lake on July 20th. Now, why would I selfishly show you a bunch of family photos? What's going to be the next thing I'm going to show you? Guess who was standing exactly at the spot that I'm standing more than a century earlier? I mean, I don't know. Can I do it? The wind's picking up now, but can I? He was here a long time ago, but when you really think about it, is it that long ago? It's not really that long ago. These stories from more than 100 years ago, not really that long ago. Okay, the last thing I have for you, he dies suddenly at the age 53, and I would like to finish by reading a little bit of remembrance of Israel among the geology community. This is 5 pages. I'm not going to read the whole thing. But this was written by Alfred Lane. I don't have Alfred's backstory, I'm sorry, but he knew Israel well. Skip that. For a quarter of a century, Israel Russell was a servant of the U.S. in the Geological Survey, and that was practically his sole occupation until 1892. He ranked with Gilbert and Powell as one of the great geologists of the early years of the USGS. Like them, he was an explorer. Like them, he had an admirable literary style. I remember he once said that it was his custom never to write anything until the end of a day's work. In this, he was doubtless aided by his retentive memory. In the relatively arid regions of the Great West, where geology was on a large scale, such a method was no doubt quite serviceable and gave to his work a literary quality which content jottings cannot pretend to have. But I remember well the shock it gave me to one who, accustomed to work in the mines and Michigan woods, would have been utterly lost unless he had kept some sort of continuous notes. Artistic temperament was manifest in Russell, not only in his literary style, but in his keen appreciation of the beauties of nature, which he saw not only with an eye of the savant, but with that of the artist. His description of the ascent of Mount St. Elias in Alaska is interesting to anyone. His report of the Mono Lake region of California was so vivid that a demand was made for a reprint of the report to be paid for by the residents of a tourist advertisement of the region, for which purpose its beauty and style well fitted it. His artistic temperament was also shown in his skill and success as a photographer. Many of the illustrations of the USGS, which are reprinted in his textbooks of geology, will be found to have been taken by him. He had the knack of knowing whether a photograph would really show and bring out the scientific point, which one can often see with the naked eye so much better than in a photograph. He also took pains to get something which would make his records not only of scientific, but also of artistic value. His artistic temperament also showed in a certain fastidiousness and reserve, which perhaps made him less successful as a teacher. To be a popular teacher, one must not be too fastidious or too critical of the half-baked endeavors of the partly educated. And he had not much of that superficial bonhomie, which goes far toward making one generally popular. In Michigan University, he made no such impression as in the work of the Geological Survey. The president of the University of Michigan, President Engel, himself told me that he did not consider that it was necessary for every state university to build up a great geological department. And as Wisconsin, my alma mater, had had 2 great geologists as presidents, he did not feel called upon to rival her. Nor was Russell, with his artistic temperament, the type of man who would rejoice in running a large department. He was, however, keenly interested in the Michigan Academy of Science, which was among its early presidents and served in it many ways. As his connection with the USGS became less, he found time to take up some local problems in Michigan. and inspired many workers, and I'm going to add, including J. Harlen Bretz. Last little paragraph. He was, as C.A. Davis says, a delightful storyteller if drawn out, brilliant and witty, so that his speeches at the early dinners of the GSA and the passages at arms between him and Emerson shine in the writer's memory. Yet he was not a man of many words. Physically, he seemed small and slender for one who had proved himself an intrepid explorer, and is another illustration of the fact that much may be done by one of small size. His civic public spirit was shown to be his careful report of the water supply of Ann Arbor, Michigan. He got an honorary doctorate, because he stopped at a master's. He got an honorary doctorate at his alma mater, NYU, and the University of Wisconsin. Hey, good for him. That reminds me, I got one more thing. He wrote some textbooks for the general reader. You want to give me another second? It's after 7, but I just remember I bookmarked that. So among all this scientific work and this artistic temperament and everything else, you just heard a reference to his textbooks. I don't really have a good sense of it. But he was writing books kind of for the general public. Like he wanted to communicate this to a broader audience. So this is another memorial, but give me just a second here. There. This is somebody else. Who's writing this? Oh, Davis. His co-worker at the University of Michigan. Again, after his death. As compiled by the University of Michigan librarian, his list, Russell's list of published writings contained 124 reports, and there were 5 unpublished but completed or nearly finished manuscripts upon his desk at the time of his death, 2 at least of which will be published. 7 of his published productions are books, and his remaining publications, 30, may be classed as extensive reports. Among the books already mentioned, there are several valuable works which were in part, at least, the outgrowth of his works as a teacher. These are what he modestly termed reading books, but in reality they are monographic manuals adapted to the needs of the general reader or student, in which not only all the data collected by others have been brought together in a single volume, but the results of the wide personal investigations and observations of the writer are given, and the light of his analysis of facts and theories is added. This makes these works useful in their expert as well as valuable and available to the beginner, and they are not infrequently quoted as standard authority. I mean, you can find them, I think. Maybe you can even find them online. I don't know. Like one's called like Rivers of North America, Lakes of North America, North America. In these works, his style is simple, direct, and pleasing, a statement equally applicable to all of his publications. There is very little technical language used, and such as there is not difficult to grasp. These writings also abound in illustrative matter and descriptions of actual localities, which are considered typical, enliven and enrich the text with word pictures, which take the reader to the place described and point out the salient features to be observed and explain their meaning. This habit of making his writings clear and interesting was a fixed one, and pervaded his more technical works, as well as the group under discussion. One instance in point is to be found in the monographic study of the Mono Lake region of California. This region has recently been made accessible by rail. So this is written in 1906. And a demand came from the people living in the county in which the lake lies to the director of the USGS for a new edition of the report to be paid for by the residents who will use it in attracting the attention of tourists. The request of the committee in charge of the matter explicitly stated that the attractive style in which the report was written made it very desirable for their purposes. It was to revise his work of 20 years ago in that region that summer of 1906 was to be devoted. So he was going to do that in the summer of 1906. He was going to rewrite it so that they could use it for general purposes. In passing, it may be said that this pleasing and attractive style in no way detracted from the scientific value of his work and was cultivated with the express hope that it might make it of more use to a larger number of people, a hope which in this case was undoubtedly realized. The writer had the pleasure and good fortune to be associated with Professor Russell during his fieldwork in the Menominee region of 1905, the last of his life, and thus had a chance to become somewhat closely acquainted with his methods of work and to strengthen a bond of friendship already formed. In the intimate associations of camp life, his steadfastness of purpose, his simplicity of character, serenity of spirit, his goodness of heart, and consideration for his associates were deeply impressed upon the writer's mind. It is entirely characteristic of the man that while he was a delighted storyteller, he rarely volunteered to tell of his experiences, and when urged to describe some of his adventures, declared that he had never had any, for nothing had really ever happened to him. His love of home and his family was also a marked characteristic, and it was apparent from chance remarks that they were never absent from his mind during the entire season. In person, he was slightly below medium height and of rather slender frame, so that he seemed almost frail, but really possessed great strength, agility, and endurance, as must be apparent if his work as explorer is considered. As a man, he was upright, generous, industrious, and always ready to do his whole duty as he saw it. And as a citizen, when called upon, he was willing to give liberally and without cost of his time, energy, and knowledge for the benefit of the community. Truly, a good man has gone from our midst in the prime of a busy and useful life. Charles Davis, University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, Michigan. Okay. You still with us? What do you want to ask? Thank you for sticking with us to the end here. Sounds like his books are the beginning of a National Geographic magazine. I don't know about you, Jeff, but as a kid, I had National Geographic every month. That brown wrapper, I never read them all, you know, but they talked about exotic places. They inspired travel. The photography was always outstanding. The maps, the little insert maps. So that was a profound effect on me. And maybe many of you too. And my grandma Helen that was a Christmas present, giving me a new annual subscription to National Geographic. Why am I'm not seeing much here? Let me go. Am I not going back? We're doing live Q&A if I didn't say it. Do you want to ask anything? Seeing a lot of statements. Gene, I don't think Gene, thanks for the currents. Here's to you, Gene. Lemon currant scones, Vinman's Bakery. My highest recommendation, if you ever stop there. I don't think he got to Craters of the Moon. He got to Jordan Craters, which is he's south of Boise. I don't think he got over to Craters of the Moon. Somebody else tell me if I'm wrong. Come on, I've got questions here, but they're not on topic here. Patrick, age 6, on topic. Do you think Professor Russell and other early geologists thought Washington was Disneyland for geologists like you do, even though there was no Disneyland then? Thank you, Patrick. I always enjoy your questions. Well, in the case of Russell, he had seen a lot before he got here. I mean, he'd been to Alaska, Patrick. He'd been to New Zealand. He'd been down in California. He'd been in Nevada. So he had seen a lot of interesting things. Now, Smith, right out of the East Coast and right out of college, I'm guessing he was blown away by what Washington had to offer, Patrick. But, I mean, he did come back. He didn't just stay here 1 year and say, that's it, I'm out of here. So I'm sure that he enjoyed it here, but Russell might have been just as impressed with other places. Ozone, where had he honed the eye for the basalts? Amazing breadth. I don't know, but that is an important statement. You know, some field geologists specialize, and they're going out only, you know, they put on their glasses. I'm only going to look for glacial deposits, you know. And they just like everything else is just bedrock. I want to look for moraines and outwash and erratics. Bretz was like that, really. He was just looking at Pleistocene stuff. But then there's guys like Russell who can do it all. And I didn't read it to you, but maybe it was one of the memorials, I'm not sure, but somebody said this guy's major gift was showing up and surveying everything, like literally surveying everything, and then grabbing the major themes, like not being a minutia guy, but I think he had that I'm just spitballing here now. He kind of had that artistic sense, so he could kind of like put things together with an eye and have different elements in his composition, basically. But then he could kind of take his detailed scientific reports and maybe plug them into that visual thing. But if you're asking how did he have an eye basalt, did he see basalts before? He certainly didn't see flood basalts before. Maybe he saw some basalt flows in Great Basin. Well, he was down in the Mono craters. Those are different. Those aren't flood basalts, but he mapped some. I should go read if that Mono craters thing. If that Mono Valley report is one of his best, then that would be a fun one to read, realizing that he's on his way to Washington. I'm seeing a bunch of uppercase now. Thank you. Appreciate it. I don't know what happened there. Oh, these are just 2 minutes ago. Matt, did Russell do any research in Oregon? I don't think much. In southeastern Oregon, maybe down in the Owyhee, the Steens, I haven't read that report. That was one of his last ones out here. But beyond that, I don't think so. Wayne, have I thought about reading geology writings for audiobooks? Thank you, Wayne. I don't normally take the time to find all the links and put them in the show description. I just feel like people can do that on their own. But in this case, I will. And again, thank you to Bob in Cle Elum. I don't even really remember meeting Bob. I'm sorry. You said we met a couple times, but so I can't picture you. But without your groundwork to get those links to me in a nice, you had 3 emails, I think, and they were all right there. So I don't think I would have done this if it wasn't for you, Bob. So thank you. That saved me a ton of time. What kind of geology field tools did they use back in 1896? Asked Jamie, who used to be in my field courses with me. I don't know. I actually had my buddy Andy up in Cle Elum, ironically, because Bob, the guy who emailed me, said, I'd love to hear about how these guys made these topographic maps. Like, how did they survey this? And Andy did some research for me and for himself, I hope. And I was going to put it in this to try to get a sense of, was Russell using a bunch of base maps? I think in some cases he was. That's maybe a whole separate, I don't know, a live stream or something. I wanted, it's a whole nother crowd. They're working for the U.S. and they're out here surveying. They're making these detailed topographic maps. And how are they doing that? I mean, mule and whatever, but like what surveying equipment do they have? And how are they making these pretty impressive maps? That's not answering your question, Jamie, because I don't really know. I really don't know. He's you know what, I was scanning, looking at pictures basically today, these reports. But I assume there's some detailed description of how he acquired the data. Marin says Israel was at craters of the moon in 1901 and 1903. Wow, okay. I'd like to learn about that. And if I can find that work, then maybe that's enough to get me to do a Craters of the Moon live stream here. Because I have some experience at Craters of the Moon 80 years later, but not enough for a full live stream. Kim, what do you want us to learn from Russell? Well, Kim, I guess I chose to present Russell along the lines of what interests me. First of all, I wanted to know who the earliest workers were doing geologic work here in central Washington with these places that we all know very well, so I feel better about that. As always, I like getting to know the people the best I can and what their backstory is, and the fact that he had all this experience with the USGS, with the great survey of the Wheeler Party, and working with G.K. Gilbert, and working with Bailey Willis. These are big time people, like the experts of the day in the nation. And he's working right with them. So that to me is impressive. And then the last thing that I think is a particularly impressive thing about him is that it sounds like he was like many of the creative people that I know. One of our sons is a creative person. So they think differently. They have a different temperament. They capture the world in a much different way and interact with the world in a different way. And it sounds like this guy had both of those worlds, the part of your brain where you're scientific, and the part of your brain that's an explorer, and the part of your brain that is a visual person. That doesn't happen that often. A few more and we'll quit. Did Israel name Lake Lewis? I don't think he did. So here's another guy to look into. Maybe I'll do this one soon. I don't know. I think the name is Simons. S-Y-M-O-N-S. Thomas. I may be wrong. But he's working for the Army or something, and he's walking up Grand Coulee and describing it as an old hall that's roofless. And he's coming down the Columbia in 18, I don't know what. I think he was the first to come up with Lake Lewis. And some of the Oregon viewers, first of all, keep saying, why don't you talk about Oregon? Like, what's the deal? What's your problem with Oregon? And the basic answer is I don't know anything about what's going on down there. But a number of you in Oregon have said, why don't you do a program on Thomas Condon? Same deal. I don't know very much about him. But I think Simons came up with Lake Lewis, and then Condon came shortly after and embraced Lake Lewis. And I don't know, but I think Russell might be the third to talk about this body of water in the desert. But none of them were talking about Ice Age floods. That was Bretz's contribution. Evelyn, age 7, if you could be one of the first people like Israel, where would you go to explore? Wow. Interesting question, Evelyn. Doesn't feel like there's many places left that are so raw and uncharted, Evelyn. And I think you need that. I think you need a raw, uncharted place to try to do the work that Russell was doing, or all these guys in the late 1800s. So I don't know. Is there a place in Kazakhstan? Is there a place in Siberia? Is there places that have been barely looked at geologically now? I don't know that, Evelyn. And if that's true, and if you could get into those places, and you were, 25 and at the peak of your physical powers, I remember those days. There was a lot of energy. And there was a lot of optimism and hope, and you're going to solve the world's problems. And we all need a stage of our life like that. Thank you for the question, Evelyn. Michael, do you think that people of 100 or so years ago really appreciated these early geologists? The people of 100 or so years ago. Oh, back then, yeah, probably not. I think what you're asking is, Michael, is if I'm just a general, if I own a bank in 1883, do I know about all this work? Do I even get a chance to see it? Probably not. As I've talked about, I did a TED Talk a few years ago, and I was talking about how until recently, until the internet, from my point of view, geologists were just talking to other geologists. They were writing for other geologists. They were giving, it's a little club, and everybody's just kind of going back and forth. There's some pros to that, but there's a lot of cons to that, a lot of negatives to that. So from my point of view, the internet has opened up this closed club to everybody. And there's rare people like Israel, who was writing for at least kind of school children or something with his, what did he call them? Reading books, general books. But I doubt many people knew what these guys were up to. And they certainly weren't able to find one of these volumes like we can with Google today. 3 more and we're done. The Jackson Winfrey Project asks, do you think Russell would have done stuff globally if he had lived today? Totally. I mean, what was it, 1874? He got himself to New Zealand for something. He was in Europe doing something for a while. He was in Alaska. This is, more than 100 years ago, and he's getting to those places. So I have no doubt. I don't know, maybe the Michigan thing was because he was dealing with health issues. I don't really know. But if he was healthy through much of that life, he could have done a lot around the world. Scrolling back now. Is Mount Stewart a volcano? No, it is not. Another look at Israel now that you've heard so much about him. 5 years before his passing. "15 years before his passing." That's him, isn't it? I mean, I don't think the other guys look like him. It's got to be him. What was the quote? He would tell people, oh, I haven't really done anything. On the top of Mt Rainier in 1896. We've had a live stream called Baja BC, Misty, and we talked about the fact that this granite is 93 million years old, and it was formed down in Mexico and was moved almost 2,000 miles very gradually by earthquakes and sent up here, a process called Baja BC. So down in Mexico, this may have been part of a magma chamber, Misty, that fed an active volcano, but that's not even for sure. It might just have been a blob of magma that cooled 93 million years ago. But we will be revisiting Mount Stewart on Sunday morning with a session called Paleomagnetism. And I saw on Facebook that Merle Beck, the guy that came up with Baja BC, and was a controversial geologist of his own who was using paleomagnetic studies, he saw the schedule and he said, can't wait for Sunday, on Facebook. And I said, I think Merle's 90 or something. Like, Merle, you should be giving the paleomagnetism talk, not me. Would you join us in the live comments on Sunday? And he's like, I don't think I'd figure out how to do that, but Knock 'em dead. We'll finish at that. Let's look at the schedule. This was a long one, but I enjoyed it. I hope you did too. I won't see you tomorrow. And if you tune in Saturday morning, I think anything's possible. If it's super windy, I think I'll be standing right here. Or no, if it's super windy, I'll be in the front porch with my John Stockton autograph photograph. If I can find a wind-sheltered place, I've got a spot that I've tested out that has 3 bars, and I'd like to use that spot, but I think it's going to be howling, and even with Boxy McBox, it might be a distraction. So I might even get up extra early on Saturday morning and drive out there and just see if I feel like it's a go. So I'd say it's 50-50 whether, this is the valley I live in, 50-50 whether this is a field thing or not. And then, doesn't sound like we'll have Merle Beck with us, but I'll do my best to present paleomagnetism from the house here. A toast to you. Here's to Israel Russell and his memory and all the wonderful work that he did, gone too soon. And here's to you and your health, the health of your parents and your grandparents, children, grandchildren, as we continue to deal with the issues that surround us. Love and respect to all. And I mean it, all. Thanks for joining us tonight. We'll see you Saturday morning, 9 o'clock. Have a good Friday. Goodbye from Ellensburg, Washington, USA. I love you.